Hello, Dr. Fraud, a.k.a. Michael Skiba. How are you? You all right?
Good morning, Guy. How are you?
I'm very well. Obviously, this is our fireside chat. I don't have a fireside because obviously in Singapore, I don't think it would get much use. But let me kick off by introducing you properly. And first of all, thanks for getting up so early your time. So we have with us Dr. Michael Skiba, a.k.a. Dr. Fraud. Now, Dr. Skiba has worked in the fraud industry for over 2 decades. He's currently consulting with Inform, an international fraud solutions company, and he's VP of International Counter Fraud Strategies, overseeing international fraud projects. He's also been a professor for 15 years and is currently Department Chair of Criminal Justice at Colorado State University Global. He's a regular media contributor that can be seen on NBC, CBS, and many other networks, and has also had his book published, The Psychology of Fraud, and is a founder of the Dr. Fraud Training Group. Absolute pleasure to have you with us here today. So Dr. Fraud, today we're going to talk about the perhaps uncomfortable subject that is internal fraud. And I think just from reading out your kind of, career highlights, you yourself have had a fairly unusual journey from investigator, PhD, to author, to consultant, and I guess you swap between all of these. And look, the focus, as the title of your book suggests, The Psychology of Fraud, is a lot around the mindset that drives a white-collar criminal. And I think it's just a really interesting perspective to spend some time on. And I think in the case of internal fraud, this feels particularly relevant. So, in terms of your book and I guess the Dr. Fraud ethos, you talk a lot about situational honesty and strain theory as these pertain to internal fraud. So, how would you sort of introduce and get our audience up to speed with these kind of Skiba-isms?
Thank you. Well, good morning, Guy. And I'll have to footnote that, the Skiba-isms. I like that. As long as I can use Guy-isms, because you have many insights as well from your
They'll be trademarked. They're going to be trademarked.
Okay, there we go. So I'm really excited to talk about this topic because I think as you mentioned, I love handling, having those different hats on, because what I can do is when I do the research, I can see how it applies at a practitioner level, and also from an investigative standpoint, where I started my career, worked almost 15 years. And really what's interesting about internal fraud, and it started really early on when I was in a claims department. We had a case of internal fraud, and it was just kind of baffling to me, because I knew this guy, and I knew he was doing well. And I always thought, well, why did he do this? What prompted him? And then of course, going from that to investigating international, rings, terrorist organized crime rings, where you see, I started to see a commonality very early on in my 20s, and then that grew. And what that's based on, as you mentioned, Guy, is that opportunity. It's really about opportunity, and what I call that situational honesty. And one of the most interesting statistics that I found that I've relied on a lot throughout, all areas of fraud, but specific to internal fraud, is what I call the 30-30-40 rule. And if we're to do this in person right now, what I would do is, and I know it's been a long day for everyone, but I would ask everyone, okay, 30% of you, I'd divide the room up, stand up. You guys are all honest. Okay, so studies show that 30% of the public is honest most of the time. Then I would have them sit down, have 30% of the audience now stand up and say, okay, 30% of you are dishonest most of the time. They sit down. 40% of the audience is what we call situationally honest, which would mean depending on the situation. You stumble on $1,000 on the street. What do? Do you turn it in? Is no one around? There's all these different things that would make your decision change. So then everybody sits down. Then I have 70% stand up. Now, what's interesting about this, when we look at 70%, in a conference room, 70% of the people, that is who our potential threat is. Because you have the 30% that are dishonest, 40 are situationally honest. meaning 70% of the population have a propensity to commit internal fraud. And this is just, it's baffling, but this is what my studies 25 years have showed, is that this is what our threat is. And this is why the second part of that, guy, is that IT companies don't want to focus on this area. And
no,
unfortunately,
it's so uncomfortable, isn't it?
It's 100%, and that's the key. So when they call me a lot of times to help out, it's too late. The damage has been done, and there's that culture, that vibe that's already there.
So with this, our changeable segment, and I think it's an interesting perspective to look at this, right? So 70% of your employees, is quite a risky percentage. So, I think we've obviously, everyone, has seen the impacts of COVID-19, and various parts of the world hopefully are starting to come out, and others, unfortunately, here in Asia are back in, phase 2 heightened alerts or circuit breakers or movement control orders. It's still very much present. So, I mean, do you think COVID-19 has obviously put a lot of pressure on the economy globally? How would this impact? Because I want to kind of dig into the 40% that could go either way, right? With the $1,000. So, what do you see as kind of some of the warning signs, perhaps? Because trying to keep this out of the theory, to your point, into the practicalities of day to day. So what have you sort of deduced from some of the internal fraud cases that you've kind of seen? And you talked about strain theory. So for those that perhaps haven't read your book or are less familiar with that, and more perhaps more fin crime focused, how do you think COVID-19 and strain theory has really impacted our 40% of the situationally honest population?
And yeah, you bring up a lot of key points there. And I think one of the most important is that 40%. So, right, you have the 30% that are honest, 30 dishonest, but you have that 40% that act as a matter of opportunity. So absolutely. And we all know, we deal in numbers in some areas of our careers. 40% is a very opportunistic number. We can make a difference with 40%. So just meaning, this behooves companies to look at this. They can make an impact. Now, COVID-19, it's really interesting because I've seen so many trends, and now, as you mentioned, it's in certain areas. I know it's kind of taking a step back, but holistically, if you look at the kind of back to somewhat normal, we're kind of slowly cycling around again. So now things are settling down. We're starting to see some patterns, some trends, some cases are coming about. And here's what's interesting I found is that during the pandemic, when a lot of us had to work from home, work remote, we weren't in our normal environments. What this does, very interesting, because when you look at other criminal areas, when you look at extortion and homicide and even just burglary, what you find is that when you have a lack of victim identification, okay, when you cannot identify with the victim, crime is more likely to ensue. That offender is more likely to engage. You have the same thing happening. Like if you just follow that, not to say that we're, we cause that, we're not at that level of crime, but what you find is with COVID, it created such a detachment from people, from their companies, from their identities. They're working from home. So that created that detachment, that lack of identity. So in other words, if you're in your office at your computer, you have no sense of who your company is anymore. It makes it easier to commit an internal fraud, to pad an expense account, if you will. So on that level, there's that whole, psychological element. But as you mentioned, strain theory. So strain theory really focuses on how, certain people that can't make normal kind of, they can't, they see the end line, but they don't want to take the normal means, the hardworking means like we would do, take classes, go to conferences. They take the unnormal, unethical, illegal route to get there. So they're strained by certain extraneous factors, could be divorce, could be personal situations.
Sure.
Looping this back to internal though, companies don't have the ability to really understand someone's personal background. We don't know what an employee, unless they tell us, is going through financial difficulties, or divorce or something like that, creating that strain.
So, I mean, would it be fair to say then? I mean, you've worked more than the lion's share of kind of fraud cases, be they internal or, to your point, kind of more run-of-the-mill, organized criminal gangs. So there's clearly no such thing as your typical internal fraudster. Like, that seems a silly statement. But, what do you think? Because, I mean, in reading your book, some of the things that really jumped out to me personally, and I sort of walked away with, was that the average age, the average number of years of tenure of an internal fraudster was actually more than 5, I think, which to me I personally found quite shocking. So what would be some of the other things that kind of tells, if you like, that you've kind of detected in terms of internal fraud?
It's very interesting, right? Because we think, in our mind, I find that most companies, even myself, when I first started my career, you'd think, well, it was the new employee coming in, the one that had that idea, right? It's far from the truth. It's actually the opposite. It's the mid to upper level managers, individuals, people that have a little more authority, they have a little more seniority, but also they have that tenure. They have usually anywhere from 5 to 10 years of experience. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is by that point in time, they know the system. They kind of know how things work, know who covers what administrative assistants oversee, this executive, what executive covers what. They kind of know how that system works and know where those vulnerabilities and where the gaps are. But you would think, from my mind, I mean, working 5 or 10 years for a company, there would be a sense of loyalty.
Sure.
Yeah, exactly. But it's actually just the opposite, because with a lot of those internal fraud cases, what we always find when we look into them is there's some degree of, I want to say, negativity, if you will. Something happened to that employee where they weren't just, given the constant promotions. They're not, something happened. Could have been passing up for a promotion. It could have been disgruntled. But we find there's some little snippet. It could be very, very small, could have flied under the radar. But we always find something. So, there's no hardcore internal fraudster, as we say, where we can say, I can't tell you right now, well, this is where I think you should look because the profile's different. But most of the time we find that they're more seasoned employees. That's why when these happen, Guy, and this, most people are like, wait, Rob? No, not Rob. There's no way that he committed this, So, this is usually the discussion that it starts with. And then when it unfolds, you realize the contrived, complex nature of the fraud that employee, was involved in.
Yeah, I remember having this discussion with you, Mike, and you were talking about, people always have a way of justifying what they're doing, even if it's clearly unethical. You are stealing from your company is the long and short of the interview. And, to your point, I think you shared all these different cases of, well, I was passed up for a promotion, I should have got it. And I think that the sort of more homegrown classic that most people can relate to is, if something happens to you, if we're ever allowed to travel again, basically a cottage industry is that, if your bag is stolen, people tend to bump up the value of items, that was stolen because it feels like a victimless crime, right? I've had all of this drama. Why shouldn't I don't know, get my kid a new iPad out of it or something like that? And it's interesting in terms of how this happens in an internal fraud case.
Yeah, and I think justification is one of the most applicable theories to most everything that I have done. And it's interesting because when you look at the core elements of other crimes, even at a consumer level, because a lot of fraud that we're involved in, we can pull from. I pull research from the consumer field because some of it is related. But when we look at people that shoplift, there's always some sense of justification. Well, the prices are too high. We hear that all the time. So they decide to take matters in their own hands. Insurance fraud. Well, I pay too much premium, so they pad a claim. So in all different areas, but we find, and the reason why is because justification makes people feel better. And when we look at general honesty in the world, nothing even related to our space, but people are more likely to engage in some sort of behavior if they feel okay still about it at the end. If in other words, let's say you have $1,000, like I said, lying on the street, you're walking down, there's nobody around, you're in the middle of the woods, you're thinking, okay, well, maybe I'll pick this up. Well, it's different than if you're walking down the street and there's $1,000, hanging out of the pocket of a 12-year-old that you're going to grab from, that's going to use that for college. I mean, it's a whole different feel. So if you still feel justified or at least okay about it, then that action is likely to ensue. So 100% applicable to internal fraud, because almost every single case that I've had, and sometimes, here's what's interesting too, it doesn't actually have to be against your company. It could be, let's say they came in, they were disgruntled already from a prior employer, from another bank that maybe, they were involved in the same scenario. Well, when they got at that level in the current bank or the current organization, that kind of all came back to them, and they feel like, well, geez, I have to get back at that other bank. We've seen cases like that, but there's always that degree of justification that usually comes out at some point during an interview or doing, court, where a snippet of, hey, well, this is why I did it, because it makes them feel
the
good.
Rationale.
Exactly.
So, I mean, kind of switching gears slightly, I think, so we kind of touched on it, and this worrying stat that more often than not, they've been at the institution for 5+ years, right? 5 to 7. So, I mean, I think most people listening to this, particularly if they're in financial institutions or fairly mature institutions, will have some form of kind of pre-employment vetting or screening procedure that's pretty well established, right? That's become kind of more of an industry standard. And the purpose of this, of course, is you're trying to detect bad apples and prevent them from getting into the firm. But what would you see as some of the limitations of pre-employment screening? And the reason I ask, in terms of internal fraud, this is often the first thing that comes up when they're like, no, we don't have this. Like, we've got this absolutely bulletproof pre-employment screening and onboarding process, so we don't have that here. Like, what are the limitations that you found in your travels in terms of pre-employment screening?
Yeah, and this is so important. I'm really glad you brought this up. Great question. And I think too, right, we put a lot of effort into how most companies do, into hiring the right people. Because I mean, in our profession too, we have to have certain designations, certain education. We have to, it's not like we're just going in maybe when we're young. I mean, we have to really have a certain level of professionalism. So we have to put that effort in, right, in finding those right people. And I find companies do for the most part, they do a pretty good job, because we know it costs a lot of money to offboard an employee once they're there, and it's very risky. So companies, do focus on that. But I think one of the things is, because it's such a structured approach, that executives and others within the company just kind of use that as well. Once we get them onboarded, we're okay. So it's like, well, we have that great onboarding process, screening process, we're fine. And then they kind of let it go. And that's a huge mistake, because what we've seen with the statistics, very, very disturbing, is that when we look at those internal fraud cases, only 4% have a prior history, which is, I mean, that is an astronomical number, meaning that only 4% of those are going to show up as any blip on that internal screening process radar. So 96% completely sail through, nothing in their background, on their resumes, in their interview, algorithms that, would set off any bells and whistles that this is even a low risk hire. And that's where companies are falling short, because what we have to do is, once we onboard them, again, we're doing a great job, that 0 to 6 months, let's say, we're doing a really good job. It's the 6 months on, because what I find when I come in and consult, or if a case occurred and I'm doing kind of the post-mortem on it, there's no revisiting. You don't have those annual check-ins. You don't have any revisiting a code of conduct, or any pushback, or any of those strategies that they could use, that, to be honest, are quite easy and really cheap compared to an onboarding process. Just those check-ins throughout those, we talk about the 5 years plus for the high risk. There's usually no process of revisiting, any ethical, kind of, strength or pushback or anything like this. So it's very risky just to focus on that onboarding process.
Yeah, and it's interesting, because I think, I mean, I sort of talked to some of my colleagues around this, and I think a challenge that a lot of global companies face is that, to your point, you have your process, you're happy with the process, everyone internally signs off on it, from HR, employee relations, etc. And then there's going to be inconsistencies, because there's data I could get on you to onboard you in the States that I would not be able to get, for example, in Europe, right? And vice versa when you come to Asia. So a lot of companies talked about, by definition, just access to that sensitive personal information. In some places, you just simply can't get it. So you have this inconsistency. And I think, to your point, I think a good practice to kind of share with people listening is, to your point, particularly, well, I'll re-say the statement actually off the back of what you said. So perhaps when someone is promoted to a further level of responsibility or access to sensitive information, some of those core, vetting procedures are revisited. In terms of credit checks and the attestation approach, right? Like, I'm not exposed through this, and this, and I don't have any, delinquent debts. From the sounds of what you're saying, it'd probably be quite a good idea to double check all the applicants internally that didn't get the promotion, just in case this has, set them off on their radicalized path to bring your company down. But look, and another area, we've talked about onboarding, but also exiting employees, as well as being, obviously incredibly unfortunate in most cases. This has often been described as a real weak link as well, in terms of this kind of internal monitoring chain. Could you touch on that for a few points in terms of what you've seen?
Yeah, so this is a really sensitive topic, the offboarding. And what I find here, Guy, is that there really isn't any structure, any protocol. We know there's many companies that can help onboarding, but as far as offboarding, there's limited research out there focused on this. There's limited companies that could help with this. External companies. So companies like us, it's very hard to have a structured approach, but this is very, very risky. Offboarding is very critical. Because even if you have an employee that's with you 6 months, they still know enough to be dangerous taking it to competitors or damaging you while they're there. What I find psychologically there, guys, is the second that employee it disengages with that company, whether it's a termination, whether it's voluntary, it doesn't matter. There is 100% a sense of detachment, disengagement, upwards of 80% of even the second before. So they're checked out, if you will. Even though I'm not saying employees are bad, they're going to turn, but I'm saying from a psychological perspective, they're going from looking at their company, they're turning almost 180 degrees and thinking of their next adventure, next endeavor, even if it is a positive thing. Even though the intentions are good, they absolutely, our studies show that corners are kind of cut. They're not as motivated. This can have very, very damaging effects on all different levels because you're not going to have, you're going to be paying for an employee that's not doing what they are supposed to be doing, number one, but all the way to the gamut of causing malicious damage, contrived damage to the company, and taking that away. Now, what I recommend is offboarding as quickly as possible. And it's a fine line too, because you have to. If you have an employee that's still feeling good about the company, you don't want to come in with a physical security team, surround the person, shut their laptop, take them out, because psychologically you're going to create more problems, because then they're going to be talking, thinking, how can I get back at this company? So it's really a fine line, but it is very important. Companies should not, that being said, companies absolutely should have those protocols in place. Physically, and also, think about the property, the intellectual. So the physical property, but the intellectual property is more damaging. What are they going to do with them when they leave? What's in their mind that you have to somehow make sure stays there and doesn't, and
I think you raise an interesting point, right? That most institutions are quite happy to trust a professional third party to manage the onboarding and vetting and that sort of stuff. And the exit often seems to kind of get a little bit forgotten about, and it's handed off to HR. It's not a pleasant process. And honestly, I've heard some real horror stories, like, no password control, their accesses are still there, even to the point of, some former bank employees still being on the payroll. as literally just left and right hand scenario in terms of that disconnection.
Yeah.
But look, so obviously we get these great employees in. There's 96%, you're not going to detect anything. And I think, look, let's turn this slightly more positively. I think the vast, overwhelming 99.9% of people that join companies because they want to work there, they want the salary, they believe in the vision and all that good stuff. But, I think, and we kind of talked about what turns these people, away from kind of more of a law-abiding sort of route to this. And I think often in terms of internal fraud, you hear about, monitoring.
Yep.
We should monitor employees. And this gets really, I think this to me is where it gets uncomfortable, because these are your employees. These are your ambassadors in the market. So how much is enough then in your perspective, in terms of proportionality versus, your employee that, statistically is hopefully doing the right thing and making the company money or doing whatever they should be doing. How do you balance that with, an employee's right to privacy? And, what do you think are some of the kind of, if there is to be a monitoring program, what would you suggest? What would you advocate that institutions start to look at to try and detect, if it's possible, these early warning signs? Because I think we want to talk to preventative as well.
Yeah, and it's so funny. And this is really, in any other kinds of fraud, we're looking externally. We have a face, a victim, or not a victim. We have a threat. We know what they look like, and we can kind of focus. But internally, right? The second you talk about, hey, policing internally, I mean, it's like in a police department. Internal affairs is the least popular person, the one not getting invited to the barbecues, because they're we don't want to be seen. We're onboarding these great people, spending, we want the company to grow and expand. But hey, by the way, Guy, I'm watching everything you're doing today, watching your keystrokes. That is not the mentality that we want to push with the company. We want complete trust. So one of the things I recommend is that, we keep companies, or we keep employees, with that freedom, with that flexibility, the creativity. They need to do what they need to do, but make sure there's that safety net underneath them. So the second something even starts to just fall a little bit, so it's almost like you're not, you don't want to watch every single employee. We don't want to watch, Guy, what you're doing today as opposed to yesterday. What we want to do is just look at, you with your counterparts. And that's the key, so what we'd want to do is we'd want to look at where this employee is, within their respective positions compared to others, right?
Okay.
We want to look geographically where they are. We want to, pick these little areas. But what I mean by the safety net is somehow, there's two approaches I look at. One is using technology. So look for outliers, Guy, why are your transactions twice what your counterpart is in, another part of the country or the world? Why are you logging on early? Well, it explains it. You're a hard charger. Okay, great. But why were you also on at 12 midnight? Well, that could be an outlier. You're involved in something. So not to monitor everything you do, but the second, like some little blip comes up, let somebody know in the company to look into it. That's number one. Number two, though, is the non-tech approach. That human element is so important. Even doing training and awareness, it's unbelievable. And Guy, you and I know this. We speak a lot around the world. If I do a session on internal training, I always get feedback immediately after, like, oh my God, this happened, or we saw this, or we found this, because there's that sense of just, hey, not that we're watching you, but you want employees to know that, hey, if they do fall a little short, then there are going to be consequences there. There's not that internal affairs guy walking around all the time, but his office is there and he might come out. So we don't want to bother him. It's a fine line. You're right. You have to really be careful.
Yeah, I think that feels sensible, right? In terms of role mapping and going, some sort of peer benchmarking and stuff like that. And then other things I've kind of heard would be, sort of like repeat annual attestations to kind of revalidate that initial information you did at onboarding. T&E, so travel and expense claims is kind of a classic, right? Yes, so, and you and I have talked at length about this. So do you want to sort of share some of your kind of views around T&E? Because it seems to be an area that our situationally honest 40% kind of start pushing boundaries a little bit.
Absolutely. And we see tons and tons of fraud, those big scale cases. It's unbelievable. I would estimate, I don't have any hardcore stat on this, more than half, maybe 70% start with a small expense padding. And the reason why is because when they have that sense of leeway, when they get away with a dollar extra for a coffee, you know, or they took a friend out for lunch that wasn't, you know, that it wasn't business related, that absolutely psychologically grows. That goes into a dinner, goes into et cetera, et cetera. So those expense accounts are extremely common. And there's that sense of justification there, usually. You know, if someone's traveling, you know, honestly, one of the most justified kind of statements we hear is, well, I'm away from my family for a couple of weeks and I'm grinding 15 hours a day, but I just wanted an extra coffee or something, whatever it might be. So we really have to be careful. Companies should absolutely focus on the T&E. Absolutely.
Okay. And then you kind of touched on this, like not all abnormalities, you know, like the working hours point, like maybe he's a hard charger, or, you know, maybe, you know, this individual is actually focused on, you know, US or European markets, right? So there's obviously going to be inconsistencies in log in, log off and activity times. But you know, for those kind of less certain about this subject, and I am a little bit conscious of time, I think we're coming up to it. So, you know, what does better practice? I don't think there's such a thing as best, but I mean, what are better things that the institutions that are really looking at internal fraud can do practically? What sort of gems would you share with people listening?
Yeah, and the thing is, you know, as a final comment too, you don't have to spend. Obviously, right? If you have resources, super, you know, use them. But most companies that you know, like when I get asked to come in, you know, we can use those internal resources. You know, most of them have some sort of software package already in place.
Yeah.
We can fine tune that a little bit to focus on this area. So one, the technology, two, the human element. Focus on that training, that awareness, code of conduct. You know, the strong pushback. Things like this are absolutely going to help, you know, with that holistic approach, because, you know, we don't want to see as it's a sensitive area. We don't want to see as policing our own, if you will, but it's a huge threat, guy. Companies really are missing the mark here, you know, and looking internally. But there is that opportunity. Again, there's that 40%, you know, upwards of 70 that is our threat. So, you know, it does behoove us.
Yeah, I think reflecting on what you've shared, Mike, I mean, I think there is, you know, particularly as many of us are still, you know, kind of stuck working from home and that sort of stuff, you know, I think reaffirming that connection, that connectivity, you know, through Zoom calls or StreamYard tech like this, to make sure that you have that. I think that's really important. And I think you talk about it in your book, the kind of, you know, monitoring in a sense that is, you know, if there is one of these signals of bad behavior, I guess, to put it, that it's not right, it's instant dismissal, but it's confirmed that this has been noticed, that we've seen this, because ideally you're looking for a course correction. I mean, the assumption is that the majority of these employees, you know, you want them to stay, they're good employees. So, you know, that I think that's something as well. That's a more positive message to leave people with, right? That, you know, we can see this, it's not okay, it's not super bad, but, you know, this has been noticed, so that people don't continue pushing boundaries. I guess that's pretty key. I've heard you talk about that before, right?
Yeah, and that would be a great final comment. Is that right? I find, you know, it's not to sound all gloom and doom. Everyone's bad. All your employees, like, you know, you'll find people like looking at each other like, oh God, is everyone bad in my company? No, that's not the case. You know, but just right, have those controls in place. But to your point, most people want to belong. They want to belong to something. So if you create that identity of your company, some of the companies that do great jobs of this, like your Googles, your Yahoos, they don't have a lot of these cases of internal frauds that we see other places, because they have that strong sense of community amongst them, with groups and with identity, and sending them shirts and gifts. Believe it or not, things like that, that positive reinforcement actually has a super effect. So having those safety nets in place, the human element, tech element, but also kind of keeping that positivity and connection with the company is so important. I'm glad you brought that up. It's a great way to, you know, to do that. Yeah.
Well, I think, look, unfortunately, I think that's all we've got time for. I knew this was a shorter one. So listen, for those who are less familiar, it's The Psychology of Fraud. I've actually read it. I promise you, I've read all of it now. It's pretty good. And I think something that I would encourage people to look at is there's a lot of different presentations that Mike has given. And what's nice is you have this, I think, kind of academic research that gets fused with practicality. So you get a lot of stuff. I think that's where I've always kind of listened and taken note, because you can fold, this is the theory, and then look, these are genuine real life examples of how it translates. So look, Dr. Skiba, thank you very much for joining us. And I'll now bid the Regulation Asia goodbye, as I think the next session, or the wrap up rather, is about to begin. But thanks very much for joining us, Mike, all the way from the US.
Thank you, Guy. My pleasure.
Fortunately, we're out of time for day one of our 3-day Fraud and Financial Crime Asia 2021. My name is Bradley McLean, and I'm co-founder of Regulation Asia. As you've heard today, as financial crime reaches new levels of sophistication, institutions must respond by seeking a balance between efficiency and effectiveness to disrupt it. And while we've only just started to scratch the surface today, the next 2 days will continue to be a unique opportunity to hear directly from regulators, investigators, NGOs, and leading industry thought leaders to understand the unique challenges institutions face across Asia in detection, prevention of fraud and financial crime in the region, but more importantly, how we can be better prepared in the ongoing battle against bad actors. I wanted to thank everyone for joining us, but especially our opening keynote, Ms. Carmen Chu, Executive Director of Enforcement and AML at the HKMA, who provided us with a regulator's view on the effectiveness of AML and the financial crime risk frameworks. I'd also like to thank all of our panelists throughout the day for their insightful discussion, and our sponsors for making this event possible. It's important to note that tomorrow's session will begin at the same time, tomorrow, 1 p.m. Hong Kong, Singapore time, with a keynote opening by Hiroshi Ozaki, Director AML, CTF Policy Office, Japan FSA, who will provide us with a regulator's view on new technologies for AML CTF. Thank you all of our listeners for joining today's discussion, and I look forward to speaking with you again tomorrow.